everything's included in the grade, it adds to stress and it creates places where students can't relax.
This conversation is so interesting because we talk about the history of grading and how a lot of the practices that are happening in our schools haven't really changed in the last 100 years. Welcome to Toddle's School Leaders Project. On today's episode of the podcast, I welcome Joe Feldman, who literally wrote the book on equitable grading. Joe talks about the 3 pillars of equitable grading, and we dig into what the idea of the future of grading and assessment might look like in schools. You're not going to want to miss a single second, so let's jump right into this conversation. Joe Feldman, I'm so excited to have you here on the School Leaders Project. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for the invitation.
So I'd love for you to set the stage a little bit for our audience. Who are you? Tell us about your book. Tell us about the work that you're most passionate about.
Yeah, so I'm Joe. I'm a former high school English and American history teacher. I was an English department chair, assistant principal, principal of a couple different high schools. I worked in the central office in Northern California School District as well as in New York City. And after I finished those jobs, I wanted to try something different. So I started researching an aspect of my work that had just nagged at me, which was grading. I didn't feel like I really understood it as a teacher, as an administrator. At the site level, I saw teachers doing lots of different things and just couldn't really figure out why they were doing different things and how to help them. As a district administrator, I saw it even on a more widespread basis. And the more people I spoke with, the more people told me that I wasn't crazy, that grading was a really kind of tangled knot kind of a subject. And so I started researching grading and its history in this country and found that it's really just a fascinating history. And in many ways, we're continuing to use the same grading practices as 100 years ago. And so I looked at what is the current understanding of grading and related fields of adolescent development and motivation theory and culturally sustaining pedagogy, and tried to look at what would be ways to improve the ways that we grade, and started partnering with a couple schools and districts, and did that for about 4 years, and then wrote the book, Grading for Equity, based on what I had learned from that work in schools and districts and in classrooms.
I love that. I think you hit the nail on the head that it's something we all clearly do in schools, but it feels almost taboo, or it feels so value-laden or uncomfortable sometimes to talk about. Why do you think that is? Like, why is it so hard to talk about grading?
Well, I think that there's this weird irony that's going on where teachers feel like with all the mandates placed on them and all the expectations and roles they have to play, that grading is one of their last islands of autonomy. It's where they can bring their full professional judgment and identity to this aspect of their practice. And they are in the best position to decide how to report what students know and can do. And so I think that's a very protected area, and to start opening up that conversation. Oh, and it's very private. I think every teacher feels like it's unique to them and they've spent the work to do it. And, one of the ironies is that they've had no training in how to do this really important part of their work. It's not in graduate programs or anything like that. So there's no practice that we have as educators with talking about it with each other. There's no common language. There's no common research base. There's no real support to talk about it. And when an administrator comes and talks to it or tries to lead a conversation, there's lots of power dynamics that can be felt, around like a protection of autonomy, or, wanting to make sure that my authority isn't compromised and my judgment isn't questioned. And I think grading also gets into aspects of teacher identity. Who am I in a classroom, and what is my relationship and role, with my students? And so I think it's just kind of fraught, unfortunately, with a lot of deep emotions and challenges. And so what I wanted to do is help normalize conversations about grading. We should be talking about it as much as we talk about assessment or curriculum design or all the other aspects of our classroom, and we should be doing it with each other.
Might you clarify the difference between assessing and grading?
Yeah. So grading, as I think about it, is the formal reporting of where students are in their learning progression toward meeting certain course outcomes.
Okay.
And that can be done. When I say formal, it doesn't have to be like the transcript. It could be, saying to students, this is where you are right now, and kind of getting into more of a feedback sort of area. Whereas assessing is really the method by which you ascertain where students are in their learning. Question, because I think people get confused and start, using words in lots of different ways. And so, and I don't even
Yeah.
think grading is necessarily like the A through F scale. It could be any way that you formally report where students are in their learning.
And does it have to accompany like assigning a value? So it doesn't have to be an A, B, C, or D, but there's some
Mhm.
mastery or failure. So is there some like that's the act of grading is assigning it some kind of a value?
Yeah, I think it's essentially naming where the student is in their learning progression. If I'm trying to be
Okay.
able to, you know, make 10 free throws in a row, how many have I made so far? What's my biggest sort of gap in doing it, the number that I need to make? Or, if I'm trying to, demonstrate that I understand the Pythagorean theorem, where am I in my learning progression?
The School Leaders Project is brought to you by Toddle, your all in one teaching and learning platform made for teachers and by teachers. If you're interested in more equitable grading and switching towards more competency or portfolio based style grading, Toddle really supports you because it breaks down your curriculum and it helps us to tell the learning story, to see the picture of what's happening in our grade books and what's really happening in our classrooms. So if you want to learn more about Toddle and how it can support your grading practice, find out at toddleapp.com. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that also hits a nail on the head of potential frustration in classrooms is that we often don't have a clear benchmark of what success looks like and what those tiers of progression of success looks like. So somebody says, justify why this is a B or a C or whatever scale you're using. And there's those red flags go up of, well, I just know because there's not that shared, like you said, shared language, shared culture, shared vernacular. You touched a little bit earlier on kind of how the history of grading has led to a lot of the cultural aspects of grading that we see now. Might you give us a little bit of kind of like the flash history of what we should know about where grading comes from?
Yeah, I mean the ways that we grade now are really almost identical to how we graded 100 years ago. So this type of grading, and when I say this type, the idea that you have A through F, that you're using points to quantify those ideas was really from the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, we were really preoccupied with becoming a more efficient country. We were trying to compete with Europe, and so we needed to figure out how we were going to acculturate, assimilate, all these folks from rural areas and the people from overseas to be ready to work in factories. And so we needed to sort them. And the letter system, the A, B, C, D, F, was in large part so that we could put students into academic tracks because we didn't want to waste resources on lower tracks, right? So we were trying to get efficient with who are going to be the bosses and who are going to be the workers. And the ABCDF enabled us to easily label students so that we knew what trajectory they were going to be on.
Oh,
We also were, yeah, we were also really
deterministic.
fascinated.
It's just so deterministic, like this is who you are and this is who you will become.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we were also really interested in, as I was saying, acculturating and assimilating all the folks from overseas that were emigrating to the country, and just trying to sort of establish who would be good workers. And so we used behaviorism to really affect behavior of students. Right, behaviorism is the idea that you can most
Train people.
effectively motivate through positive and negative extrinsic reinforcement, right? Rats in a cage with the pellet or the electricity on the cage. And so we adopted a lot of those practices in the ways that we thought about students. So the whole point system, managing them, using points as an incentive strategy, was all really from 100 years ago. And because teachers have never had access to the research, and they've never really been taught how to grade, most of us as educators just replicate how we were graded. And we just
Right.
continue to use the same strategies, the same techniques, even though there's no research to support it. In fact, the research all points against what most teachers do.
Something that comes to my mind here, and this is a theme or a trend that I feel across educational movements, like whether it's No Child Left Behind or this industrial revolution of education, is that like it came from a good-ish place of intention. The goal was to, try to help people assimilate and to prepare them for what was success at that time. And I think what we need to remember as teachers is that just because it was created at that time with good intentions doesn't mean that those intentions serve us now. And like those are the questions we need to be asking is what is the function and what is the end game now? And are my practices still in alignment with that?
Yeah, I'm a little less generous than you. I'm a little more equivocal. Um, I think we were, you had folks like Dewey and folks who were really thinking about like how can we really like build an educated citizenship, and then we had other folks who were like, we need workers, we need workers, and we had other folks who were like, let's educate all kids, and other folks who were like, nah, we don't want to educate all kids. That's not really important to us. I think the biggest thing is really to your point is that things are different now. Like we have different
Right.
belief systems, right? We believe all kids can learn, right? And we create standards that we believe just about every kid can hit, right? And we also believe that they should get to decide what they want to do with their lives, right? We don't want to sort of lock them into a particular academic track that they can never escape. Um,
From.
and we also know that intrinsic motivation is a much better motivator. Extrinsic motivation is actually a pretty bad motivator. Um,
Yeah.
so, we've got to think about what we want in our schools and what the research says about effective teaching and learning and apply those to every aspect of our practice, including grading.
I love that. Oh, progress. Might you speak a little bit to the traditional grading system and when you see it happening in schools, what is the effect on not only student performance, but just kind of on the culture of a school when we're using those outdated
Mhm.
practices?
Um, well, I mean, it's one that probably most of us are very familiar with because we were in those schools. So it's where teachers use a lot of points. The points are the primary sort of uh, language of learning.
Mm.
Kids talk about points. Teachers talk about points. Um, you know, I think that's and it can be really stressful for students um, at both ends of the sort of ends of the success sort of trajectory, right? The students who are, really super consumed with getting an A all the time, and they feel the pressure, and they have oftentimes a fixed mindset around who they are and what mistakes might mean. And then students at the other end who just generally haven't been very successful in schools. And so they just keep seeing the same thing at low points, and they just can never claw their way
Mm.
out of a 0 to 100 scale that's very demoralizing and is really architecturally sort of built to disproportionately punish students. So there's a lot of stress and a lot of talking about points. Um, and I think that there's a lot of ways in which that creates classrooms that are performance spaces. That, if I go into a class and I know that every day I will get up to 5 points based on whether I have my materials or whether I raise my hand or whether I come in on time. Um, and every discussion is included in the grade, and every time there's classwork is included in the grade. When everything's included in the grade, it adds to stress, and it creates places where students can't relax and they can't have an off day because everything counts. um, so I think those are kind of two sort of cultural ways and sort of atmospheric ways that the ways that we grade changes how schools are in ways that we don't want them to be.
Right, because you extrapolate that. You think 10 years down the road, and I was one of those kids. I loved the tests and I loved, being the top performer. But what does that do for your sense of purpose and value and identity when those things are no longer there? And what does life look like and how do you motivate? It's we leave our kids with this really big gap of purpose, I think, when we create those kinds of cultures.
And unfortunately, kids come into schools not talking like that, right? When you go into kindergarten classrooms, first grade classrooms, kids are just into learning, and they make mistakes, and everybody knows it, and they keep trying. And um, it's not until really like third, fourth grade, upper elementary, where teachers start talking about points, and managing behavior through points. And that's where it all starts. And I think one of the things teachers find when they change how they grade to grade more equitably is they find that students actually haven't forgotten what it means to be intrinsically motivated to learn and to be comfortable making mistakes and like
Mm.
and to stop talking about points all the time. They actually can remember that, and come
Yeah,
back to that with teachers' help.
I like that. Might you talk about some of those shifts? I feel like I kind of got ahead of us here of talking about the culture of both, but could you talk about some of the shifts that lead us from this more traditional approach towards a more equitable approach to grading?
Yeah. So people are like, well, what is this then? You talked
Yeah,
all
what is
about
it
what
actually?
happened. What is it? Yeah. So equitable grading it really has three pillars. It's where grades accurately describe where students are in their learning. They're
Okay.
bias resistant. So grading counteracts some of the institutional biases and prevents our own implicit biases from infecting the grade. And then it's where grades are motivational. They build students' intrinsic motivation and their sense of efficacy and self regulation skills. So there's a whole lot in those three pillars. Um,
Mm,
I think one kind of I'll sort of take them one at a time a little bit. So around accuracy, I mentioned the 0 to 100 scale, and it's really helping us as teachers better understand why the architecture of that scale makes it so mathematically unsound to use, and what are alternatives to using that. I'm not saying we shouldn't use numbers to describe where students are, or we shouldn't have ways of defining it in gradations, but there's a lot of problems with the 0 to 100 scale. And we can make that better using 0 to 4 or 1 to 4, for example. Then there's the bias
okay.
resistance. So, in many ways, traditional grading incorporates things outside a student's control into the grade. These are sort of the institutional biases. So, students whose families are of lower income, they're less likely to be able to do some of the things that are traditionally included in grading, like extra credit assignment, like, you go
Mm,
to the movie based on the book, or bring in cupcakes for the potluck we have at the end of the learning, or things like that that require resources, time, money, supervision, something like that. So it's making sure those things aren't included in the grade, as well as implicit biases. A lot of times teachers will ask students to behave in certain ways, whether it's you need to sit
mm,
quietly in your seat, or you need to take notes a particular way, which really doesn't. And oftentimes, what a teacher is doing is they create an archetype of what they look like when they're learning effectively, and compare students to that and reward them if they match and punish them if they don't match, even though there's a whole universe of ways that people learn, and can be. And then the final is around motivation. A lot of times we do things in our grades that demotivate students. Um, and we can be more motivational by, for example, looking at where students are in the end of their learning, rather than sort of include every mistake they make along the way. Because if you include when students make mistakes and that in the grade, it's going to demotivate them. And instead, if you said, yeah,
right.
make mistakes, those mistakes aren't going to be included in the grade, only how you are at the end, you keep students engaged and motivated to keep learning and keep taking risks in their learning. So that was like a super big overview
You see
of
me over
all of
here
it.
just like scribbling like a crazy person. I have so many questions for you.
Yeah. Well, there
So,
is a whole book on this. There is a whole book.
okay, Joe. Could you just dig a little bit more into the 0 to 100? Because I, this is probably a fallacy of thinking on my part, but I guess when I hear 0 to 100, I think, oh, well, I can be more accurate because a kid is exactly a 78 versus a 1 through 4. Then I'm just jumping into this, you're just a 3. So, how is it more accurate to move towards a smaller scale?
Okay. So I'm going to
You're
talk
like, I don't know
about.
what to begin with you.
You're not the first person to ask. Let's first talk about inter-rater reliability. I'm going to get a little statistical on you. So when you have multiple gradations, right, from 0 to 100, and you asked two teachers to look at a piece of student work, the more
Mm,
gradations you have, the more likely that those teachers will not agree on where
right.
that student is, right? Because they have so many choices to make in them. The fewer gradations, the more likely that teachers will match on those, right? It's like if I asked people to estimate the width of the room and I told them to do it in inches, they're going to be a lot more variance in their answers than if I say measure it in yards, estimated in yards, right? They'll
Right.
be a lot more likely to be. So there's a value in having teachers, having a student's work get the same grade regardless of which teacher is looking at it. And the fewer gradations, the more likely you will have that consistency. So there's a real value in having fewer rather than more. The
So it's less
second thing is
random.
more. Yeah, I mean, it's not random from the teacher's point of view, right? They're trying to be super precise, right? But the problem is that they're going to be much more likely to be different from each other, which is much more confusing then to the student. The
Well, and
second
that's where
reason
the
is that,
bias comes in. Like that implicit of like, oh,
yeah,
well, like I was actually looking to see that your handwriting was neat. And that's what pushed you to a 72 instead of a 79. And the other teacher's like, I don't care about handwriting.
yeah, and that could have, I mean, and that's also got to be figured out. Like, what do we include and not in
Right.
the grade, and what constitutes, right? That gets into calibration. Like, well, what is a three? What is a B? What is a C plus? Right? You're getting at all the complexity of this. The second reason is that it's a little artificial, right? So if I
Mm,
said, to an English teacher, tell me the difference between a student who is at a 84 and a student who's at an 85. What's the difference between those two
yeah.
students in their writing skills, right?
Well, one brought the
It's just
cupcakes,
it's
Joe.
well, well, or one is higher than one is 1 point higher than the other. That's best, right? So I think that it's a little artificial to believe that you can really make those gradations in it. Even math teachers or science teachers or something that has, I had 100 points and you got 86 of them. You didn't get 85, you got 86, right? It's still artificial because you have made questions what you wanted to make them and you have scored them in the way that you wanted them to be. So an 86 in algebra 2 can mean anything regardless, depending on which teacher you have for it. When you have fewer gradations, you could say A, B, C, D, F, right? Let's just say, or 1 to 4, which is the same thing. I could say, okay, I'm teaching the Pythagorean theorem, right? What is A level understanding of the Pythagorean theorem? What's B level understanding? What's C level understanding? What's D level understanding? And then if I want, I can do pluses and minuses because maybe there's a little bit of variance in there. But then we can come to agreements as math teachers, right? We can look at a bunch of student work. We can understand that these are B level. So now when a student does a piece of work on the Pythagorean theorem, I don't have to say you're 8 out of 24 or 16 out of 90 or whatever. I can look at it and be, the totality of what you've just shown me shows me that you're at a B level understanding. And it's so much simpler. Um, you know, it's so much clearer and simple, and it's very similar to what students have in elementary school, and it's the
Mhm.
GPA scale. So that's a snap. Um, the other problem around the 0 to 100 scale is around the mathematical unsoundness is when, because we have a scale in which we have 2/3 of it that describe gradations of failure, right? From
Yeah.
0 to high 60s is basically subpar performance, right? And we're saying, we as your educators, we think that it's, really important that we distinguish a 19 from a 26 to a 28 to a 31 from a 32. Like we have all these levels of describing failure.
Failure.
And then we have about a third of the scale to describing success or competence, right? So that's weird right off the bat, right? That doesn't send a great message to students. And when you've got a scale that's designed like that, when you get low scores, it exerts a
Take it.
gravitational pull on everything else, right? We teachers know
Mhm.
that kid gets a 0, that's an atomic 0, right? That will just pull down the grades disproportionately because we're using a scale that has this kind of architecture. There's nothing sacrosanct about a 0 to 100. Nobody uses 0 to 100 outside education at all, right? Anytime you have to demonstrate competency, bar exam, medical boards, nursing, architecture, nothing. Driver's license, nobody uses the 0 to 100 scale, right? They have a cut score or a cut number, and that's it, right? There's just no reason for us to use that anymore.
That's really cool. And one thing and I'm not sure if you noticed this, and even in your language, when you switch from talking to 0 to 100 to 1 to 4, all of what you described of student success became understanding language. Instead of, I think we can get so pulled down into the nitty gritties of like skills and acquisition of knowledge and these nitty gritty things. But when you zoom into those or zoom out into competencies, it becomes these higher level. What will students understand? What will they take
Mm-hmm.
away? And we turn our minds then towards transfer as opposed to just like myopically focused on success now, which is really cool. I like
That's
that. Would
right.
you say that
That's
that's
right.
the biggest shift? Like moving away from the 0 to 100 is like the biggest, easiest shift a school can just like do right off the back and like make their school more equitable?
I know I'm not going to say that because it's very tempting for the reason you just described. Oh, what a snap! I will
Again,
just put it at
is it
50,
a
or
little
I'll
more
make 50
nuanced
the
than
minimum.
that, Joe?
Piece of cake. It is really difficult because, again, like I think teachers I think it's a common error, actually, of school and district leaders is where they see this glaring problem. And it seems like a no brainer. Like, why wouldn't you change it knowing what you know? Right. So they're like, all right, I'll make a policy that'll solve it. And what it does is it doesn't really acknowledge the need for us to build the capacity in our teachers to understand the why. They actually, these are not technical changes. These are adaptive ones and ones that are based on deep theory and ideas. And teachers can all get there because they can learn why it's bad and why it harms students and why it isn't helpful for them and how it can actually improve their practice. They can learn those things. I mean, we work with teachers and help them. And once they work it through, they have to think, well, what do I do about it? If I have a minimum 50, do I like, and a kid doesn't hand something in, what do I do? Do I make it a 50? I don't like that. And what do I do something different? Or if I have a 0 to 4 or 1 to 4, now I don't have as many choices. And like, how do I explain this to parents? And what about the software? Like, I have a grading software that doesn't allow me to put in 1 or 2, 3, 4. It only has percentages. What do I do about that? Like, there's just, and then parents have to be educated. Wait a minute, where's my kid's percentage? I thought they were always going to get a percentage. What have you done? Why are you messing with my kid? So there's so many complexities around there, and it requires really deliberate education, um, and just dialogue to help engage
Mhm.
all the constituents that you serve around why the why of this and why improving grading to be more fair and accurate is really a lever for larger instructional change. It's not like this tiny little bow on the end of the at the end of the present. Like, this will help everybody in the system better understand what we're here for and what we're trying to communicate and expect of our students.
So, just as leaders, we're not looking for the product. We're not looking for the final quick fix. We're looking to make space and time for these valuable discussions and for that thinking. Because you could, like you said, you could just come in and mandate something, but then the culture isn't going to change. And that's what we're after as school leaders is a systemic and cultural change.
Yep. And you're really touching on this pressure point of teachers if you start changing how they grade. Because as I said, like, they protect this space, they are the authority. So, you know, do this at your own risk, leaders. We've seen it. I mean, I'm a former leader and I get it. I get it. You want to solve the problem. But we've just seen too many times the administrators get ahead of the teachers, too far ahead of them. And that's when the problems start happening.
So where do you begin, Joe? Like, because it's a sensitive topic, it's a topic that takes a lot of time and shift in practice and unentrenching ingrained habits. So if you were a school leader recognizing in this chat, like, oh, dang, I think my grading is a little bit more on the biased side, what's
Mhm.
that first leaping spot for you?
You start with educating the people around you and coming onto getting to a common ground with the other leaders in your school or in your district, so that you all can agree that this is something to prioritize and
Mhm.
there's some urgency around it, and it actually until we do this, we will never get to the outcomes we want. I mean, we can have the most amazing curriculum and incredible, multimodal assessment strategies and culturally sustaining pedagogy and diverse curriculum and all kind of hands-on learning. And it can all get undermined if we house it all within our traditional grading system. And I think
Hmm.
if leaders can get on the same page about that why, um, that's step one. And they'll take time, they'll spend a semester reading the book, or we'll do just workshops for leaders, and that includes board members, right? And maybe it's teachers union leadership as well, or department chairs, right? We all gotta like agree that this is something worth our time and worth our energy. um, and then I think the next step that we found most effective is where you start with finding a set of teachers who are interested, um, have the social capital, have capacity in terms of time or experience or stipends or something, who can actually go deep into this work and start trying the different practices. That's the primary way that we partner with schools and districts, is to work with a cohort of teachers over a couple years to build their capacity to help be resources for colleagues and to generate an evidence base for the district that says, look, this isn't just in this book. Like when we stopped doing X, great things happened. When I changed to a 1 to 4 scale, when I stopped including homework in the grade, which I haven't talked about, or when I, stopped including extra credit and I did this and I used rubrics and all these kinds of things, amazing things happened. And that's what I think is so important for a district to generate and to have in order to help to then start moving it throughout the system that ultimately leads to policy change.
Well, and what a beautiful space to center the discussion on, because I think it can easily, all of these discussions around assessment and what's worth assessing can just feel so big and overwhelming. But grading is almost this like this touchstone that we can all come back to. And I think that if you were to make those shifts in the grading itself, that it would trickle into those other aspects of assessment and culture and beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, one of the kind of great things about talking about grading is everybody has an opinion, and they all feel deeply invested in it, right? Once you start talking about grading, people are like, it's about me. This is really important to me because I've spent a lot of my time figuring this out, and I know that I haven't based it on anything except what I experienced. So
Right.
I'm engaged. And even though it's about grading, it really is not just about grading, because once, to your very point, once you start talking about these things and opening them up, you start opening up other discussions around assessment and how do we give feedback to students and how do we help engage them, if not through points every day for every activity, right? It starts opening up all these other discussions that are really valuable, and should be had. And this is a vehicle to get to those kinds of questions.
Mm. It reminds me of doing like a home renovation project. You're like, I'm just going to change this little light fixture. And then you take it off and the box of lies unveils itself.
Mm.
Joe, we've spent a lot of the conversation looking backwards, at grading and at assessment. And
Uh-huh.
I'm curious because I'm guessing in your work, you've gotten to be in some cool spaces where you're seeing the future now. So, what are you excited about in the future of grading? Like, what really sparks you, either things you've seen or things that you hope to see in the next few
Mhm.
years?
I think that 10 years ago when I first started doing this work, there weren't a lot of people talking about it. There was a group, standards based grading was there and people were talking
Mm,
about it, and mastery grading. I mean, there was kind of language out there, but I
yeah.
think particularly, as I said, because of the pandemic, it really accelerated people's interest in it. And so I think there's a lot more people talking about it, and which I may think makes it a lot easier for schools and districts to start having the conversations too, and they don't feel so alone in it. Um, I think it's really cool that college and university faculty are talking about it too.
Yeah.
Um, even, I've been having conversations with folks in the college admissions world,
Yes.
and they are very aware that teachers grade in all
Tell me.
kinds of different ways and aren't necessarily very trustworthy oftentimes. And they we sort of see this pendulum of the SAT and ACT standardized testing come back, where it's now starting to be required in more college admissions processes. Even though it kind of went away from the pandemic, it's now coming back. And I think part of it is because when teachers' grading is so variable, and we're seeing some evidence that suggests there's greater grade inflation from grades than there had been, that
Mm.
admissions folks need to rely on something
Some metric
so
that's
they right, so
consistent.
they can trust the grade. And I think if and they will say, if we know that the grade represents a student's level of understanding of the course content, that would be so helpful. But right now, the grade is like this omnibus grade is what it's been called, where the idea is it includes how they did on homework, and did they raise their hand, and how they do on the test, and how they do on this unit, and did they come on time, and did they hand it in on time. Like, all those things get compressed and
Right.
collapsed into the grade. So it could mean anything, right? A student could have a B because they know the content super well, but they always came in late and every assignment was late. Or they could
Mm.
have a B because they didn't know the content so well, but
They're
they
so
were
nice.
wonderful. They were just an angel, and they did all the extra credit stuff. And they just really connected with the teacher. And that kid has the B. And so, as long as that's the case, I think we teachers are really inviting and licensing the standardized testing world to do its thing. I don't love standardized tests, and a lot of teachers don't like standardized tests, but we're letting it happen, I think. And
Yeah.
this is actually an opportunity to build our credibility, build our professionalism, and build trust, I think, in the grade, because we teachers are in the best position to describe students' readiness for the next level, not a test. But until we can really work out this 100-year-old problem, and I think we're getting better at it, until we work our way through it, um, or I think, and when we work our way through it, I think we'll really be able to push back against standardized testing, and really establish ourselves in the professionalism that we deserve, frankly. So everybody's talking about AI right now. I
Yes.
think that AI can actually will help push equitable grading in a couple ways. One, I think that one of the really big aspects of the motivational pillar is to make grading transparent, make the
Hmm.
expectations transparent, right? So if I'm going to go back to my Pythagorean theorem. If I expect you to know the Pythagorean theorem, I'm going to tell you what level of understanding you have to demonstrate that just that would describe your understanding as an A, B, C, D, right? It's a rubric, it's a proficiency scale. And AI can be really helpful in generating proficiency scales, right? You
Yep.
could say, here's an example of an A, B, C, D, F, or here's three examples of each, and here are the criteria. Create a rubric, right?
Right.
And then you could even have students submit um, samples of the work, and then have AI tell where they fit on the rubric, right? And I think you could get
Immediate feedback. Yeah.
immediate feedback around fixed standards, fixed outcomes that would at least help to mitigate biases, would um, have feedback more quickly. And we know how important it is to have quick feedback. I don't know that I would use that for summative assessment and kind of final judgments of teachers, but I think that in itself could be a huge driver in getting this work to move a little faster. Um, yeah, I think there's something there.
Mm. The thing I hear from teachers are a big, like a bulk against AI being used in that way is they're like, okay, so the AI is going to create the assignment and the student's going to use AI to complete the assignment. And then the AI is going to assess the assignment, like that it
Yeah,
becomes just this like AI loop. Do you worry
yeah,
about that at all? Like I'm on it. I don't really worry about that much, but do you
yeah.
worry about it or how do we overcome that?
Well, I mean, I think we've got to think about, when a student is in front of us, they have to they have to do the work on their own. You know,
Mm,
one of the I think one of the reasons why teachers fear AI is because there's no way that they can effectively control whether or not kids use it outside the classroom. They can kind of inside, but they can't outside.
right.
So here we go, when they include homework in the grade, they are building an incentive for students to use whatever means they can to complete the assignment in the most effective way, right?
Right.
My tutor, my older brother, my parent, or AI, right? Because all I'm asked to do is do the homework
Get it
well
done.
enough so that I get the maximum number of points. The homework is essentially for the teacher. It's not for me, it's for the
Right.
teacher. I'm going to show them the best I can. When teachers stop including homework in the grade and they say, look,
It's for
when you go
you.
out and shoot, yeah, it's for you. When you go out and shoot free throws in the backyard, nobody's counting up your free throws and then bringing it to the game. So when I assign homework, it's practice. You do
Cool.
it. You want to use I don't care. You want to do it on your own? I don't care. How do you learn best? But ultimately, it's there to help you learn. So when you have the assessment in class that's going to see where you are, it's just you. So maybe I even open it up and take a poll of students who used AI last night, who didn't use it,
How'd it
how'd you
go?
use it? Yeah, how'd it go? Then let's do a quiz and let's see like the people who used AI, did they do better, worse? Does it
And if
help
you
you?
did
Does
do
it
better,
hurt
how
you?
did you use it? Help us
Exactly.
understand.
Exactly.
Right.
And right. And there might be kids who used it and didn't do well. Oh, let's figure out what happened. So it's not like this magical ticket to like help you do well. You
Mm,
actually have to use it in particular ways. Or maybe you don't need it, but you do, and that's okay, right? I think all these ways of when you don't include homework, you open up these really important metacognitive and other ways of thinking about learning to build students' capacity to know how they learn best and what
yes.
can make them successful. So then they go to college where no one's, dropping off points if they come late or checking to see whether they did homework every day or when they go in the professional world, right? You didn't ask me, hey Joe, how long did you prep for this interview? Because I'm gonna make it's gonna be better or worse depending on how. No, if I do okay in this, I know I prepped enough. If I don't do okay, I didn't prep enough or I didn't prep the right way, right? That's how the real professional world works. And so we can help equip our students to be able to be successful in that world when we give them the chance to do it.
It's just, I just love how it comes back to this larger theme of just removing punitive measures. Like so many times we use assessment and grading as this punitive thing, is like you
Mm.
said, like it's that points culture. And when we can shift towards learning is something I'm teaching you to do for yourself so that you can go and be successful in the world. And this is a task I think would be helpful for you to do because we noticed together that this is a skill that you're working on. How much more meaningful of a conversation and a task is that for a kid versus like, you're going to get more points if you do this homework. Of course, you're going to use AI for that. And I think that is ultimately what AI does for work now in schools is it challenges us to ask, how do we communicate the value of this to our learners for themselves in their lives now and beyond school? So
Hmm.
just this beautiful thread there of just purpose and intention.
Yeah. There's this great quote that the when you don't trust people, you try and control them more. And when you trust people more, you try to control them less. Um, and I think there's really something in that um, students are really capable of pretty amazing things. And sometimes we as teachers spend a lot of our time controlling their behavior and really preventing ourselves from seeing what students do and certainly prevent them from showing it and expressing it and growing in those areas. Um, and we I think particularly have done that for historically underserved folks, students of color,
Mm.
black students, Latinx, indigenous students, and students of lower income and who have special needs. I mean, I think we have really used grading to punish those groups disproportionately, because we have particular ways that they should learn or particular things, agendas that we're trying to, or I shouldn't say agendas, it's really not that, like particular kind of ways of being that we use grading to push students to or away from. Um, and I think we can actually like get beyond a lot of that through these ways. We know that we have these kinds of biases in our grading. Like, I have students write their name on the back of the paper, right? Because I know that if I see their name, I might, grade them differently. And so have kids put their names on the back of the paper. And I think that this sort of controlling the environment, and not recognizing how I bring things into the environment that make it a more controlling space, I think is one that this kind of work helps interrogate and open up.
Ooh, that is cool. school leaders and teachers, I think if you come away with one big question to continue pondering in this episode, it's what am I trying to control, and who is being served by that, and how would trust make everything better? Trust.